Serenbe is a place where people live, work, learn, and play in celebration of life's beauty. And we're here to share the stories that connect residents and guests to each other and to nature. This is Serenbe Stories. This season, we've talked with journalists, thought leaders, and influencers who visited Serenbe about how their lives and the industries they report on have changed in the wake of the coronavirus. Today's guest is Charles Bethea, a journalist and staff writer for The New Yorker, who has been covering the pandemic and whose latest articles feature the first weekend of protests in Atlanta and Georgia's primary election. We talk with Charles about what stories he's working on, how his editors choose those stories, and how he remains objective throughout the reporting process. But first, Serenbe Stories is brought to you by the Inn at Serenbe. The Inn is nestled in the rolling countryside of bucolic Serenbe, where guests can walk on the 15 miles of trails through preserved forest land, the wildflower meadow, and the animal village. You can relax by the pool, hot tub, or in rocking chairs on the wraparound porch, play on the croquet lawn, swings, and in-ground trampolines. Connect with nature and each other, all while staying in luxurious rooms on the Inn grounds or within the community of Serenbe. Book your stay today at serenbeinn.com. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Serenbe Stories. Charles Bethea is here today with us. Charles is an Atlanta native, and he's written for a ton of different magazines, including Outside, Atlanta Magazine, Wall Street Journal, GQ, and he's currently a staff writer for The New Yorker. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And we've got Steve here today. How are you, Steve?
I'm good with all things.
I love it. I know.
Looking forward to the conversation with Charles.
Definitely. Charles, tell us a little bit about what you're doing out in Oregon and why you're out there and why you're not in Atlanta. What's going on?
So before the pandemic, before the deluge, before everything changed, my partner and I had arranged a house sitting opportunity out here. It was sort of open-ended. The owner of this great house in Hood River took off to Calgary with his family, and the house was vacant. And I was looking for a place to work on projects that had different views, both literal, views out the window, but also just talking to different people, getting to know different topics and subjects and trying to sort of expand what I write about. I've been a Southern correspondent for a while, and at some point will probably branch out and move elsewhere. And this was sort of an opportunity to try that. So we've been here since mid-March. We came out here just as everything was changing.
That's amazing.
It's a beautiful place to be.
Yeah. Are you a big windsurfer or?
No, I do most of the other things that are on offer here in the outdoors. Skiing, mountain biking, road biking, gravel biking, everything you can do on a bike, hiking, trail running, even a little swimming in the cold water here.
Uh-huh.
But I haven't tried the kite surfing. It looks both really fun and really hard to learn.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a beautiful little town. It's so quaint.
Yeah. It's just opening back up. I'm actually just starting to get to know it better this week as businesses start to reopen.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So that's been an interesting beat that you've been covering. You've been covering COVID quite a bit. Is this something, had you ever done any kind of public health or in the past? I feel like I had one of the first articles I read, you had done an article on a runner. I want to say maybe for Outside Magazine. This is like 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I've done a few running related pieces. I'm not sure which one you're referring to. Was it Fair Chase by chance?
Yeah, Fair Chase. Yeah.
Yeah. So that actually was turned into a little Netflix documentary that was available until recently about why we run. But yeah, I haven't done a whole lot of health related reporting. I did do a little profile of a doctor in Georgia who responded to the Ebola outbreak a few years ago. But apart from that, I would say my writing has, in the last couple of years, been mainly focused on politics, especially Southern politics. I covered Roy Moore's ill-fated campaign in Alabama, John Ossoff, Stacey Abrams, various Trump-related things. And before that, I was doing more of sort of outdoor writing with Outside Magazine, Men's Journal, and all those other ones you mentioned. So, a lot of like me, a lot of reporters now are having to shift into the public health writing world for obvious reasons. And I think it's good and useful to have folks switch gears.
Yeah, definitely. I know that you grew up in Atlanta, right? And I want to say, Steve, you knew or know Charles.
Absolutely. His mother's a legend here who, that's why I never have trouble with Bethea. You see, she's just actually with his mom. But no, Sally Bethea is really responsible for cleaning up our river.
Yeah, she is a hero. Thank you, Steve.
How was it growing up with such a powerful mom?
Well, I'm sure most people can relate to this. You see your parents in one role and not so much their other like public facing role. So my view of my mom is of a wonderful, nurturing, sometimes slightly more involved in my life, my brother's life than we wished kind of mom. But she also has this, river warrior sort of side of her that she developed over the years that it's sort of hard for me to see those two things side by side because they're so different. But, the more I do the work that I do and even cover environmental and water related issues once in a while, the more I run up against her legacy, it is a pretty incredible one.
Mm-hmm. Did you always want to be a journalist, or did your mom encourage you, or how did you choose that path?
No, I was kind of subtly taught or encouraged that I was going to be a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. He retired a few years ago. He was also an English major like me. And I always figured I would study English and then put it to use in a way that I could, make money and do something sort of conventional. And as it came time to sort of like go down that path, the idea of law school was kind of onerous and overwhelming. And instead of going down that path, I got an internship at Outside Magazine. This was in 2005. Outside is sort of the preeminent magazine that covers the world outdoors in all senses. And I got that internship, moved up to Santa Fe, and lived there for 4.5 years, and still very much miss that part of the country. And covering those subjects is a little bit more fun, I would say, than going to a Trump rally. But
yeah.
But the work that I'm doing now feels in some ways more important. Not to diminish at all the work at Outside Magazine; they do great stuff. But engaging with politics like I'm doing now seems like kind of the number one subject to be involved with as a journalist.
So speaking of politics, it's the day after the Georgia primaries, and we weren't really going to talk about politics today. We were really going to talk about COVID and journalism and what you're sort of seeing out there. But you put up a piece this morning for the New Yorker that was titled "Georgia Betrays Its Voters Again."
Strong headline. I did not cover the headline, but I think there's ample reason to think it's true.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about, we all voted that are on the podcast here today and have been following the long lines and the broken machines or no paper and on and on and on. But tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, like what you're hearing.
Well, as I think I mentioned to you guys, I wasn't planning on covering the primaries. I figured once I got back to Atlanta, I would probably cover the Ossoff campaign or some facet of the Senate race. Mm-hmm. But I woke up yesterday morning to a number of emails from voters, some of whom I'd spoken to in 2018 when I covered the midterms. And one of the folks that I spoke to was like, this is deja vu all over again. I mean, there's the long lines, the broken machines, everything you just named seemed to be happening again. And it was both dumbfounding and sort of predictable to some that Georgia hadn't gotten its act together and made voting easier, more straightforward, more fair. So I did a piece that was, it's sort of a vignette that looked at the experience of 3 or 4 folks, predominantly in the more blue collar and predominantly Black parts of the city, and the experiences they faced as compared to folks who voted elsewhere. And just sort of heard their voices and juxtaposed those voices with those of some of the state officials and county officials who were bickering over whose fault it was.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And is there an answer there? Because what I sort of got out of the piece, and I think we see this a lot in politics today, is that they're pushing off, or pushing down, oh, it's the state's problem. Oh, it's the county's problem. Because it's not our fault. We're not in charge of it. And so what did you see and why is that happening? Why does it continue to happen? A year later, we're still in the same place.
I mean, I can only speculate. I think that to answer the question well requires, really in-depth reporting, but certainly the speculation is that one party, the Republican Party, largely controls at the state level how elections are run, and it may be to their advantage to make it difficult for some folks to vote. It's all as simple as that. And, how exactly that played out behind the scenes, whether the Secretary of State, Raffensperger, or other folks, deliberately made it difficult to vote, or if it was just a matter of incompetence or what have you, that is yet to be sort of shown. But my piece was just more of a piece to look at the actual experience of the voters encountering these problems. And I think subsequent stories written by me and others will try to pull back the curtain a little bit.
Do you have any suggestions of obviously besides us getting out and vote, but, how to use our voices to sort of help make that change,
I think that's a better question for activists, but I think, just being aware, getting outside your own bubble, focusing on the experiences maybe of those who are less fortunate, less privileged, who live in areas where voting is harder in this state of Georgia. Just that awareness is useful, and sharing that awareness. And, I guess there are groups like Fair Fight, which is started by Stacey Abrams, the Democrat, and they're trying to make it easier for these historically marginalized communities to vote. So I suppose getting involved with them could be beneficial. But as a journalist who tries to remain objective, I mean, I have my own views. I don't want to be too partial or partisan on that.
Totally.
So
yeah, and I think really it's all of us. Like, we're all in this together, and really I it's so much dislike when we have to talk parties, because it's really we're all part of this. We should all find the solution and really be going for more people being able to vote and voice their opinion. Period. Yeah,
exactly. It's not about the thrust of the story. I was talking to folks who were predominantly Democrats, but it wasn't about we need to get more people voting for John Ossoff. It's just about getting more people to vote, period.
Exactly.
That's democracy.
Definitely. Another piece you did, which I really think is interesting, probably from your time up there, is the story totally different on COVID in Washington. This was about the story about a sheriff or a couple sheriffs, if you want to sort of set it up a little bit for us.
Yeah. It's Hood River, where I live, is right across the Columbia River Gorge from White Salmon, Washington, and Klickitat County. And over there, the county is very polarized. You have on the western edge of the county this kind of like an Outside Magazine audience sort of a town called White Salmon. It's more liberal. It's more geared towards recreation. And then as you go east, you get these more sort of rural farming communities and these folks who maybe are a little bit more inclined to vote conservatively and support the president. And there's a sheriff of the county who is aligned with the latter group over there in the east side of the county. And the sheriff has been pushing back, like a handful of sheriffs in Washington, as well as in other states, on the protocols established by the governor of the state, who was a Democrat. So you have this sort of power struggle between the more liberal governor of Washington and the more conservative sheriff in the county about how we move forward, about whether businesses should be open, about whether certain suggestions, strongly worded suggestions by the governor, are indeed constitutional or right or just. So you have this local versus statewide conflict set up. And even since the writing of that article, which outlined that sort of building tension, it's gotten more heated. And the sheriff, this guy Bob Songer, has come out and said that if contact tracers get sent to the county by the governor, he's going to be open to arresting them for trespassing if they set foot on private property. So, and a lot of those people are National Guardsmen who are going to be doing that work. So you're setting up kind of an insane conflict. And it's all centered around how we move forward, which is a debate playing out in different ways all over the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Steve and I have talked about this a lot, that there's a lot of confusion out there. It doesn't really matter where you sit and if you're supporting one side or the other from the politics, but even the WHO puts out stuff and it's like a little bit of confusing. You can catch it from surfaces. No, you can't really. It is asymptomatic spreaders are everywhere. Oh, no, you can't. So it is understandable why people would be confused. And I don't know if I firmly believe that there is a pandemic and COVID is happening. But I just think that we've had such poor planning, from the federal level and communication, that there really isn't one voice. So to your point, everything's been set up for conflict.
Yeah. It is scary. It's frustrating. And I think, the wisest thing from my point of view as a civilian, as much as a journalist, is to defer as much as possible to public health people, not politicians.
Yep.
Whoever those public health people may be. And of course, their views aren't or their understandings are still evolving. We may hear conflicting things from public health officials, but clearly it's not useful for local politically motivated figures like sheriffs to wade into this and say things that are sort of inflammatory and potentially dangerous just to stir up their base of support.
Right. I mean, Steve, I know that you've seen, with all of the hospitality here, we're obviously following all the protocols, all the CDC, but it is hard because it's different state to state.
Yeah, it's different from state to state and from country to country. This is going to be one of the greatest lab experiments that the world has ever undertaken. Meanwhile, there are small businesses crashing, and I'm not sure where. And we become so at extreme corners, it feels, that we haven't found that middle ground. And that's the concern regarding everyone, public health officials, politicians, scientists. So it's a very frustrating time. And when you think of the other things that could be happening in the world, how are we going to face the next major crisis? Whether it's a food epidemic, something with our very fragile power grid. We are so disconnected and so lacking in leadership that it really takes pause. This isn't something that hasn't been predicted. It just is when.
Yeah, predicted by George Bush of all people in 2005 or something. I mean, it's not like we haven't heard this from both sides.
Yeah, dismantling the budget, whether that was a budgetary reason to put money elsewhere, or the current president didn't like the past president, so he's just attacking, everything that they did. It's really been such a detriment to, obviously, the country and really globally. What else are you seeing in your reporting? So that's sort of like a snapshot of a sort of local state fight. What are you seeing? What are you hearing out there overall that's sort of different, trends or?
Well, one of the first things, like the second day I set foot in Hood River, I was just trying to wrap my head around the many facets of the pandemic as it unfolded. And the editor of the magazine, David Remnick, sent an email I was copied on that said, "Hey, we should look into this notion that people are going to start buying guns. Just everyone's going to go out buying guns."
Yeah.
And liberals and Democrats who are opposed in some way to guns are going to start buying them because they're petrified of the potential outcome of, food shortages and people at their doors trying to take things. And so I went to a local gun shop here, again, the day after I showed up.
Wow.
And just hung out for a few hours. And within 5 minutes, a woman walked in who had never touched a gun in her life, who was very much a liberal, lifelong Democrat. And she was there to get a gun because she thought people from Portland were going to be running out of food in a month and were going to be coming to Hood River to pillage and plunder.
Wow.
And this was not like a wildly paranoid person as far as I could tell. Generally, she seemed like she had a sound mind, but So I did a piece for the magazine for the Talk of the Town section that I often write for. It was short, but it just captured that kind of moment. So I've been looking for a lot of those kinds of moments that show different ways in which the pandemic is really changing our society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And did you interview that woman in depth?
So for those stories, it's less about like a one-on-one interview and more of a fly on the wall perspective. So I watched as she engaged with the shop owners who were very open about their support of the president and about the importance of gun rights above all. And I watched them talk to her about what she was trying to do, and they were helpful, maybe a little patronizing to her. As she walked out, they were sort of like, man, there's lots of these types of liberals coming in here. I hope this opens their eyes to why guns are so important, et cetera. So I captured that scene as maybe only 1,000 words, the story, but it was less about, me asking her to break down the Second Amendment and her views on it, and more just capturing her moment of panic.
Yeah.
Now, have you talked to anyone? I think the interesting point is in this idea of our armed troops coming in to control the cities, and this is the exact thing that people have been worried about.
Yeah, right. So so maybe in some ways their fears can be somewhat justified. The odd thing is it's the president that most of them support who's sending in the troops. So it's kind of a weird scenario, to say the least.
Yeah, well, and I think to go back to the piece the piece in Washington on the sheriff, it was really about constitutional rights, that they felt that, and you hear this everywhere. Don't tell me you're taking away my right to leave my house. You're taking away my right to do the things that I do every day. Who are you to tell me, these things?
Yeah, I think it's that that tension that we've seen forever between liberty and safety, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of there being regulations that are put in place to try to create the safest situation for everyone, that, yes, as a result, maybe, I don't want to use the word infringe, although some would, mm-hmm. they sort of tighten the notion of liberty some of these people want to feel, but mm-hmm. it's done out of an abundance of caution.
Mm-hmm. When you look back at I was born in the 70s, but seatbelt laws, that was fought. Airbags and seatbelt laws, or even after 9/11, all of the changes that were made to the airplane so nobody could get into the cockpit, those were all fought by the airline industry. So there is this interesting tension that happens when we have these dramatic crises in America, and that sometimes, can we imagine not driving with seatbelts now? That sort of seems crazy.
Yeah, and there to unpack that example you just gave, one of the interesting things about, as I understand it, at least about the seatbelt thing, is that obviously it was a good idea, but it had the unintended consequence of people starting to drive much more fast and recklessly once they wore seatbelts. And I think, and I haven't seen figures on this recently, but someone told me actually deaths went up, at least in the short term. So, these things are complicated.
Yeah, definitely.
No one's saying don't wear seatbelts or don't put them in cars, but, human behavior is complex.
One of the most interesting human behaviors is we now live in a smoke-free environment. And when I grew up, you would have never expected that. So I'm curious, growing up right in, one of the great environmental households, how do you think this all might be affecting? Talk about attitudes. Have we become addicted to seeing blue skies, and will the actual public start moving some of these things forward, as they ended up doing when they got tired of sitting in smoke-filled rooms and saw the difference?
Do you mean as a result of the pandemic, people are engaged more with nature and they're going to care about it more now, or?
That is correct. And places that have said, well, no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. And now they've seen in a very short time, our waters have cleared, our skies have cleared, the air has cleared. And I think it's made everyone realize, it is human behavior, and it can be changed in a very short period of time.
I haven't seen, big surveys of thoughts on that, but I think absolutely you're right that an unintended great consequence of the pandemic is that we are seeing these diminishing levels of pollution in air and water, et cetera. I do hope more people make the connection between their behaviors and that consequence. I can't, I'm a little bit cynical. I'm not sure I'm full of hope on that count, but I certainly hope so. I mean, in a place like LA, where the air is suddenly, you can see the sky, maybe see a few stars at night. Surely people are connecting that with the fact that the highways aren't packed with cars or weren't. I don't know what the case is now, but that was, at least initially, that was what pictures coming out of LA look like. So yeah, I don't know, Steve. I mean, I hope so. I don't know though, if we're an accurate, if the way we think about this is a reflection of how America does.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that brings up a good point of, before sort of COVID was the news, and now obviously the protests are in the news, there were these raging wildfires. Remember those?
Yeah, sort of, dimly.
Yeah. And it's sort of like, it's just all pivoted. It's so interesting just culturally. And is it the media? Is it us? It just, obviously these other topics are hugely important, but I really thought that 2020 was going to be sort of the year of the environment, right?
Right.
I thought we were sort of on track to have that conversation and really start to maybe move that forward in a higher, further outside of sort of the green or environmental like-minded individuals.
Yeah, I think there's reason to think that was the way things were going to play out. I think now maybe it's more of a secondary or tertiary story. It's still a very important story. It's the big story of the next few years or decades. But when we get a video of a police officer kneeling on the neck of somebody until he dies, clearly that's going to be raised up, rightly so, as a really important story that's reflective of another huge problem in this country, which is, or a few problems: racism, police brutality, et cetera.
Yep.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a bad thing that the climate story or the environmental story has taken a back seat. Hopefully they can coexist.
Yes.
But when we talk about the media making choices, I'm sympathetic, and obviously I'm biased as a member of the media, but the media and the New Yorker maybe is a little bit more immune to this than some magazines and papers, because the New Yorker, as I understand it, knock on wood, is doing pretty well financially. Most newspapers and magazines are not. You're seeing cuts across the board. And I actually wrote a piece for the New Yorker a year or two ago about a Kentucky newspaper, the Courier Journal, and the cuts happening there that actually were largely, at least initially, on the environmental beat. They crunched some numbers and determined that they were going to have to cut most of the staffers, if not all of the staffers, on that beat, because I guess fewer eyeballs traditionally came into the paper to read those stories, even though those stories are critically important, especially in a state like Kentucky, where you have all kinds of environmental problems. So at a paper that actually won a Pulitzer in the 50s on its coverage of environmental issues, is now not a designated environmental reporter.
It's incredible.
So we have to be understanding when we talk about or try to point, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but some people point fingers at the media and say, hey, you're missing this story or that story. Well, there's fewer and fewer people to cover stories.
Yeah.
I mean, at AKC too. It's tough. So got to support the local papers and the national ones if you can.
Exactly.
Stories covered.
No, it's incredibly important. And I think there's so much content out there. And as a consumer of media and of news, it's very hard to figure out, where to even go for when you want coverage of something like that, because it's gotten so limited. And, so much of everything is just sort of yelling, the latest moment at the top of your lungs, which, is super important in this time and day. But, 6-7 months ago, I'm like, I don't need any more politics. I want actual substance. So that's a great point about the New Yorker. And that's good to hear that they're doing well, because that long format journalism is super, super important for somebody to be able to dive in to a topic and a story.
Yeah. And the New Yorker's trying to do what it's always done, which is the long form stuff, but also get more engaged with breaking news. That's why the story of mine that you read today, that's reflective of that. Was the story I wrote, in 10 hours following the election yesterday. There was no time to do something more in depth than that, because New York was trying to compete with and provide news that's breaking, as well as the more considered months-long investigative stuff that I'm also doing occasionally. So, the New Yorker, here's a plug. Like, I hope everybody supports it, because we're trying to
subscribe at home here with a actual printed edition. It's rare to get paper in the house anymore, but we love it.
Yeah, and the digital subscription is great too. You can
digital is fantastic. Yep.
And I write probably 80% of my stuff is digital only, and some 20% is print. But both places you'll find journalism that's fact checked like none other in the industry, edited incredibly well. I benefit from some of the best editors, and I think the writers are okay too.
No, your writing is extremely compelling. And I think I need more of that in my life, is because everything is so short, quippy, Twitter, these, Apple News, whatever it is. And to be able to sit with a piece and spend time is so rewarding, but I don't do it enough, and I think we all need to be doing that.
I don't get through every issue of the New Yorker either. I work there. So
just skip through the cartoons and What are you working on right now? Or what do you want to be working on? Like, is it a two-way street? Do you pitch stuff up or are they sort of pushing you specifically on certain topics?
Well, I think I was hired. So to go back a couple of years, I was hired as part of an experiment they were doing when they got an infusion of money from the parent company, Condé Nast, to try to have more satellite reporters and satellite offices. Historically, New Yorker writers have lived everywhere, but they're trying really hard to have regional writers who understand those regions rather than parachuting in. Okay. So I was hired a few years ago as a Southern correspondent for the magazine, and I was hired not coincidentally around the time Trump was elected. So, they wanted me to tell those stories, and I didn't come into it with a political background as a political reporter at all. I just came into the job with an ability to tell human stories, and if they intersect with politics, fine. So I didn't come into the job at the New Yorker with a great deal of political reporting experience, or, if I'm being honest, even an interest in devoting my career to politics. And I don't think I have, but they've leaned on me heavily for that kind of stuff coming out of the South. For the last few years, for good reason. There's a lot of important political stories to tell that reflect on the South and the country as a whole. So I've worked on that stuff, and they've directed me towards a lot of political stuff, but they're open to me doing other things. I wrote about, and this is kind of an Outside Magazine-y type topic, but a debate over a polar expedition record that was set a few months ago by Colin O'Brady, and there was a huge kerfuffle in that world about whether or not it was truly a first and what constitutes a first. So, I still kind of move around and do different things depending on my time and my interests, and my interests are more wide ranging than just politics. But to the question of what I'm doing now, it's actually, I can't get into too much detail. I'd be happy to chat off the record about it, but it has to do with a rather privileged community in Atlanta and how it's dealt with COVID, and how authorities have or haven't really investigated it the way they have other areas of the state, such as South Georgia, where I wrote a piece about Albany. And the predominantly Black community down there that had a few funerals that led to some outbreaks. And that story, which I told, but other people told as well, was one that we quickly heard a lot about. It was much more transparent what had happened, and the state investigated it, and numbers came out, and we knew what happened. There's sort of a similar story about an emerging outbreak in Georgia that's happened later, mainly among richer white folks, that there's still a lot of question marks around. So I'm trying to dig into that and understand why it is we don't know as much about that. So that's one thing I'm looking at right now. But I don't know. I may be directed to do some other breaking news stuff. That's more of a long-term project.
Yeah. Do you think that whether you come back to Atlanta permanently, or you had mentioned that maybe, you'll sort of go back out, maybe west again, will you be looking, what type of neighborhood or place will you be looking for? Because I think nature, obviously all of us on this interview are huge supporters and passionate about it, but has it changed you by living in the Hood River?
It's reconfirmed feelings I've long had. It's not as if this is the first time I've lived in more harmony with nature, but it is a good reminder of how important that is to me. And I don't say that in a throwaway way. Like, it really is. I feel a lot better, just more grounded, more at peace, whatever cliche you want to use. They're all true. Being closer to nature and being able to engage with the trails that abound out here. And, I don't want to hate on Atlanta. Downtown Atlanta even has some surprising amount of, parks and trails of its own. And then Serenbe, not far off from Atlanta, offers, even more. So, yeah, I think when I return to Atlanta, I'm going to try to prioritize to the degree I can those experiences, and then more long-term look at moving back to a place that, whether it's in the South or the West or whatever, that's more kind of in the middle of nature. Mm-hmm. But I do want to say that, like, people in Atlanta, many of them don't realize how much there actually is to do, whether it's the Chattahoochee, whether it's stuff in North Georgia, or whether it's, some trails, little mountain bike trails that go through downtown. Like, in Serenbe, there's a lot for people in Atlanta that they don't realize.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, and I think that, there's everybody's still trying to connect it all together, right? Steve, mm-hmm. The path with the river, with the Beltline.
Yeah, thankful for what your mother did. There's interest in the river again, and so now the new Riverlands project really looks at the corridors. So the mile on each side. So that's 200 square miles running right through Atlanta from Beaufort Dam to south of us.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah, and so that could be one of the largest recreation corridors in a major city.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it, like much of my mom's work.
But sort of what she did laid the groundwork that this could come on. And Trust for Public Land and the Atlanta Regional Commission has really taken this on.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely.
We'll send you some stuff. It'd be another great story.
Please, yeah. When I get the chance to experience Serenbe again, because it has been a few years since I spent more than an hour or two there, I'd love to talk about story ideas with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The last thing I just want to touch on is just to keep on the COVID. It's so interesting is that, we were talking that, numbers are starting to spike, and I know everybody's trying to attribute it to different things. Mm-hmm. Do you think that you'll be covering more of that along with these stories that you're speaking of, like just in general?
Yeah, I think as the health threat remains moderate to high, they're going to want me to help articulate why that's happening to the best mm-hmm. degree I can, and what the impacts are, both to health, but also perhaps to politics. To anybody listening, I'm very curious to hear about Republicans, maybe folks who voted for Trump, who have been moved by the pandemic in some way to shift their thinking around politics. So please reach out to you guys or to me. I'm at Charles_Bethea, Bethea at NewYorker.com.
Perfect. We'll add that to our show notes too for you.
But Charles, the interesting thing, I've heard this especially from like California and some of the states that have had a real shutdown. They have sort of sympathized with some of the Republicans, and so I think it's going both ways. Interestingly enough.
Yeah. I don't mean to suggest that it can only go one way. But I think it's interesting that from the Democrat point of view, at least, Trump has done so many egregious things that haven't really impacted his core of support, that his handling of the pandemic, or his overseeing a pandemic where 15,000 people have died, does that crack any of his support or not, is an interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I would layer on, like, does all of everything that's going on with the protests and his handling of it, is that actually what's really starting to crack it?
That too, yeah, right, exactly. Those are at least two recent avenues that could contribute to cracking the mm-hmm. support. It's been so steadfast. Mm-hmm. So we'll see.
We'll see.
Lots of fun ahead.
I know. I think it's an important time to be engaged. And so I really, really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us because I think people need to be reading the New Yorker. They need to be having conversations and they needed to be understanding what's happening so they can make change and be
Thanks
part
very
of it.
much. I agree. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Well, we hope to have you down soon. And thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Charles. Take care.
All right. Thank you all.
There are two rubrics in building a city. You can follow the sprawl mentality, or you can preserve land while boosting economic development. Serenbe builds and designs to be both beautiful and environmentally sustainable. If you're a city planner, developer, landowner, or policymaker, there are common sense solutions you can take to build a biophilic-centered community. Attend the Nigran Placemaking Conference this fall to learn more. Details at nigranplacemaking.com. That's NYGRENPLACEMAKING.com. Thank you for listening to Serenbe Stories. New episodes are available on Mondays. Please rate and review the podcast and make sure to email your questions for Steve Nygren to stories@serenbe.com. You may even get to hear them on the podcast. More details about episodes and guests are available on our website, serenbestories.com.